Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
This occurred back in the early 1990s when I was a teenager. My parents were not strict, so I had a lot of freedom. One of my friend's parents owned a huge part of a nearby woods where we would spend much of our time. We built a makeshift hut, so this place became our sanctuary for a long time. One friend spent the night at our sanctuary, which none of us had ever done before. We only hung out there during the day and then went home. Because of this, we all planned to spend the night together because it would be fun. Some of our friends weren't allowed to spend the night there though because of their parents, and the others just chickened out because they were afraid. So it was just me and one other kid, my friend's cousin. We weren't close at the time and fought a lot. But surprisingly, we got along well that night. At around 11 p.m., about 10 minutes after laying down in our sleeping bags, we heard rustling. I sat up and saw a very tall silhouette of something that looked to be human-like. But the weird part was that it was also transparent. I could see right through it. I squinted and froze. It very quickly climbed up a nearby tall tree. When it reached a large bough, it stopped moving and simply disappeared. I was in complete disbelief and shock. I had no idea if this was real or if I hallucinated it. I wasn't scared, actually more perplexed. I said to my friend that we should leave, and not wanting it to hear me, I got close to his ear and said there was something in the woods looking at us. After I said that, I saw his facial expression turn into fear. So we got up and started walking down the path toward the edge of the woods. We did so calmly. I didn't want to sprint because it might give chase. Very shortly after we started leaving, we both experienced this weird feeling of déjà vu and confusion. It was like we were hit with hard drugs or something, even though we didn't use drugs and only ate food from home. I did have a small flashlight. I felt disoriented, but we continued to walk in this direction for quite a while, stumbling in the darkness. Because of our mental state, I realized we should have been out of the forest by now. I knew this was the way out after going in and out of this place for years, even in the dark. I didn't recognize the trees and landscape around us, just the path. It was like our surroundings were changing. Then my friend sees the transparent thing I saw earlier. It was perched on a tree branch in front of us. He pointed it out to me. I told him that is what I had seen earlier. We stopped and watched it. It had a heatwave effect. We stared at it for 10 seconds in disbelief. It looked like a transparent being, but there was a defined edge around it. It then quickly climbed up the tree a little more and then jumped into the next tree. It was completely silent. As well, the woods were completely silent. Then, for some unknown reason, we both panicked and started to run. The surroundings still seemed foreign, but we just wanted to get away from this unknown being. We were beginning to wonder if we had gotten turned around at some point because we should have been out of the woods by this time. But, as soon as we started to fear that we were lost, we suddenly began to recognize where we were. We exited the woods and quickly made our way to each of our homes. The next day, we all met back at the sanctuary. My new friend and I described to everyone what had happened to us the previous night. There was a lot of kidding and teasing, but there was also a sense that each of us knew that something unexplained had actually occurred. Gradually, each of us started to spend less time in the woods together. We all seemed to drift apart and found new friends over time. I occasionally wonder if the encounter with the transparent being was the reason why our friendship faded away.
I guess my encounter is about something called the Glimmerman. I'm from Southern Ontario, Canada. It will be mid-July 2018. My boyfriend and I were spending a day in Toronto at a few restaurants, had a couple of drinks throughout the day, and then decided to kind of head back to the hotel early and crash. I woke up at about 5 a.m. or so. I do wake up fairly early, but not this early. I was trying to go back to sleep. It happened that there was some light from dawn coming in from the windows. The curtains were drawn in the hotel room, but there was some light coming in. I noticed that I could hear it. It was my boyfriend talking in his sleep. I looked over at him. I guess there was probably about 3 feet of space between where my boyfriend was lying on his side of the bed and the space between the wall. As I looked beyond my boyfriend, I saw a shimmering movement along the wall. As I continued to watch, I distinctly made out a humanoid form. It was kind of rocking back and forth. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I was tired and imagining this. Then I saw a pair of eyes manifesting on the face of this being. As I watched, my eyes turned a bright yellow color. Then the being crouched down and out of sight. Then suddenly it popped up right beside my boyfriend. I saw a shimmering hand reach up and cover my boyfriend's face, then pulled back when my boyfriend made a gasping sound. Then it happened again. I started shaking my boyfriend, but he wouldn't wake up. The being then stood up and started walking around the bed toward my side. I immediately jumped out of bed and headed toward the bathroom. I entered and slammed the door. I yelled for my boyfriend to wake up, but I heard no response. Then I heard him gasping again. I opened the door and saw the being lying on my side of the bed. I stood and watched it, again yelling at my boyfriend to wake up. Then suddenly, my boyfriend woke up and let out a horrific scream. He looks at me with wide, terrified eyes. I looked over to my side of the bed. The being was gone. My boyfriend tells me that he had an awful dream that someone was trying to smother him. I started crying. I told him what I had seen. At first, I didn't think he believed me. But the more I talked, the more he realized that his dream was similar to what I was describing. We quickly packed our bags, checked out early, and then drove home. Since that day, my boyfriend and I have been married. We bought a house and plan to start a family soon. But I occasionally see the same Glimmerman. I believe he hitched a ride back with us from Toronto. He isn't here all the time but seems to show up at the most inopportune times. Can you tell me what to do? Can this being be removed? Is it a spirit or a malevolent entity?
I'm writing to you from North Dakota, and I was intrigued when I saw the term Glimmerman on different boards. I had a similar encounter 2 summers ago in the area called Kimball Bottoms, or as the locals call it, the desert. Anyway, I was down there at a drum circle they were having, and I don't know if it was the drumming that attracted this thing or what. I was facing the water and banks of the Missouri River, and it was still being light outside. Around 7 p.m. in the summer. I could see everything clearly. I thought I saw a heat signature on the opposite bank, like heat rising off a hot parking lot in the summer. This stood out to me as I'd been staring in that area. Anyway, zoning out as I went into an almost trance-like state due to the drumming, I started seeing this thing move. I stopped drumming and walked over to the edge of the bank. The more I watched, the more I realized that this heat signature looked like it had arms and legs and was like swaying to the drumming still going on behind me. My friend came up and asked what I was looking at, and as I pointed it out to her, other people from the circle started to notice that we were pointing and staring at something across the river. More people stopped drumming and joined us at the bank. Some could see what we were seeing and others couldn't. Eventually, nobody was drumming anymore, and this Glimmerman had stopped swaying and was watching us watch him. More than one person had mentioned that it looked like it was invisible yet visible. It was after maybe 3 minutes of watching this invisible being, and yes, many people tried taking pictures and video of it, only to not see anything when reviewing the images on their phones. Not surprising when you are trying to photograph a nearly invisible heat signature looking thing. At one point we could see this thing move back into the tall reeds and were surprised as the reeds parted. Those who didn't see the being couldn't help but see the reed part as it moved away. A few of us sat there for a good hour waiting to see if this invisible being came back, but we didn't see anything. However, many people freaked themselves out by talking about where this entity could be. Was it lurking in the water, walking along the shore, hiding in the trees? I have to agree they all had viable points. It was a very surreal encounter and only deepened my beliefs on things existing in the folds of what we call reality.
My husband tells of an account of a Glimmerman sighting that I am retelling. I just had him repeat it to me again to make sure I didn't mess up the story. He grew up in Vermont, so it is very wooded everywhere in the place where he lived. It felt like a very benign place as far as absolutely everything else goes, but still, where there are lots of woods there is strangeness. I firmly believe that the woods are not a human domain. It belongs to the animals and God knows what else. So about 30 years ago, when he was still in high school, he and his buddies were hanging out at a friend's house, and the edge of the forest was probably 50 away from the porch where they were hanging out. My husband has never smoked or drank or done anything mind-altering due to a medical condition he has. So there he was, of completely sound mind, just randomly looking at the forest edge when he sees a tall, invisible humanoid figure strolling along the edge of the forest just inside the tree line. He watched it slowly walking the length of the property and out of sight. He said that he would have never noticed it if he hadn't been looking directly at the spot where it appeared initially and that it was so bizarre. He didn't tell his friends and just played it off like nothing happened. The only description he could give, besides the weird predator-type invisibility aspect, was that it was definitely humanoid-shaped. It was slowly swinging its arms and was definitely tall. My husband is a no-nonsense, practical, down-to-earth sort of man with a lot of integrity. So he's not the type to make things up like this at all. He has seen a number of strange things in the woods over time here in Vermont. I'm intrigued by his account, but hope that I never have a similar experience.
My wife and daughter walk our family dog at the Flying Eagle Preserve here in Citrus County, Florida. There was an old Boy Scout camp in close proximity to the river. Recently, she had seen something that she could not explain. A type of creature that was 6 to 8 feet tall. She described it as a shimmer resembling the camouflaged form of the predator alien in the movies. It would refract sunlight in subtle blues, pinks, and yellow rainbow-like colors with a silhouette that would suggest it had a long tail. It was really hard for her to put it into words.
In the year 2005, I was in the United States Air Force. There was a shortage of security police at Davis, Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, and I was put on a temporary assignment. I was patrolling the National Guard side of the base with another airman when we saw that the lights were on in an office building we had just passed, moments before the lights were turned off. We went inside and there was a long hallway. Out of one of the rooms, a tall, invisible, shimmering creature came out and started moving rapidly toward us. The airman ahead of me by about 10 feet moved over and made himself flat against the wall. As it passed him, this thing was coming right at me and I froze for a moment. The airman yelled, "Get out of the way." I did at the last second. I saw this thing move past me rapidly and there was a strong gust of wind behind it after it passed me. It just disappeared about 2 feet past me. After that, whenever I tell someone, they don't ever believe me. But I'm glad that there are other people in this world that have seen something similar to what I've seen and that I'm not crazy.
I'm no storyteller, but I will try to recall as much detail as possible. Now, my experience happened on September 2, 2022, so not that long ago. I had been out throughout the day running a few errands here and there for my dad, who is elderly. Later that same day, to return back to my dad's apartment, which just happens to be in a tall residential building in Chicago. His apartment is 6 floors up. At some point during the earlier evening, I decided to go out on the balcony for a quick cigarette. I was standing there just staring out into thin air, not really thinking about much or doing much. As I stood there with my cigarette in hand, I shifted position and began to observe a very large tree about 20 feet away. It was roughly about 15 feet down from me. I noticed that one of the branches on this tree was bowing quite heavily, which I remember now thinking back was quite odd at the time. As I'm staring at this branch and trying to make sense of what my eyes are seeing, I have this horrible feeling come over me. The most intense sense of dread and fear. It was like almost every part of my body was screaming at me to turn around and run, but I didn't know why. At this very moment, the bowing branch that I had just been observing began to shake violently, despite my internal instincts still screaming at me to leave. Curiosity had now gotten the better of me and I started to move along the railing to get a closer look. Then I saw it. What I saw at first was a small glimmering form. As I stared a bit closer, this glimmer then became what I can only describe as a transparent human figure that shimmed a yellowish-white color. I snapped out of my fixated stare and quickly took a step back from the railing. It suddenly hit me that what I was looking at was like something straight from the movie Predator. More specifically, when the predator is using camouflage. At that very moment when I realized what I had just seen, this thing dropped out of the tree and hit the ground below. It landed directly behind a man who just happened to be walking past at the time. The man immediately spun around, assuming that someone had thrown something at him. The only thing I noticed was a cloud of smoke or dust arising from the ground behind the man. I waited for some time expecting to see this thing re-emerge from the dust or smoke, but it was completely gone. At the same time, another neighbor just a few floors below had also observed exactly the same thing as me, and they managed to confirm all the same details. The neighbor and I then managed to track down the man who was walking past a few hours later. We had a conversation with the man and he said that he'd felt an impact but didn't see anything when he turned around. He also went on to report that he felt the same dread that I'd experienced only hours before.
I live in a very rural part of northern New Jersey, in Sussex County. Behind my property and to the left of my house is all forest. There are a few trails. Next door to me is a protected wilderness area where you can't build on it. Every once in a while I would take my son in his little wagon and would set up on the clearing and have a little picnic. We were playing a few feet up before you went into the woods. So we're playing on the little clearing and he starts to mimic the sounds that he hears, for instance, the neighbor's dog, birds. He mimicked the sounds around us, like the squirrels running by and the chipmunks. All of a sudden I turned around to get him some fruit salad or whatever we were eating that day, and out of the corner of my eye I saw him just stop. He's saying, "Mom, Mom," but he's staring away, not looking at me. He's looking into the tree and he's pointing, but he's not blinking. I turned around. I asked, "What do you see?" "Do you see a birdie?" Then it hit me. There were no sounds. He starts walking into the woods, but the whole time he's looking up. He's still not looking where he's going and pointing up into the tree. The only movement I see besides my son are leaves rustling in the trees. Then I see it and it's like heat rising up off the concrete on a sunny day, but it's in the tree and it's like crouched down. One arm is out to the side and its knees are bent. Immediately I feel this thing's glare burning into me. Then I hear the clicking sound. As soon as his eyes snapped to me, my son looked at me and freaking panicked. It had the shape of a humanoid. It's so hard to explain because it was human-like, but the way it was crouched reminded me of a praying mantis. My son is then mimicking a clicking sound that this thing was making. I grab my son and we run back to the house. All the food and everything is left in the woods. I told my friend about what we experienced that evening. He went back into the woods and gathered my belongings. He stayed in the woods for about an hour, telling me later that he did not see or hear anything unusual. That was 6 months ago. It is now February 2023. I have read a few Glimmerman reports from others online. When I go outside during the day, I occasionally hear those same clicking sounds coming from the woods. At night, while in bed, I hear the faint clicking sounds emanating from the deep woods. I believe that this Glimmerman is stalking us. I asked my neighbors if they heard the strange clicking sounds. They have not. Maybe I am only allowed to hear them.
The date was Thursday, September the 8th, 2016. I was on a trip from northwest Pennsylvania to visit a friend in North Carolina. I had been driving for about 5.5 hours now when I left Route 64. I drove onto Airport Road and came down to a little town called Beaver in West Virginia. I stopped at the KFC there to grab something to eat. When leaving, I made a right out of the parking lot onto Route 19. I was driving slowly as I hadn't picked up speed from pulling out just yet. If I were not driving slowly, I'm sure I would never have noticed this. I was approaching some leaves spread across the road when I noticed that the leaves were moving, but there was no wind blowing. I slowed down, thinking that there may be an animal in the leaves, and I didn't want to hit it. I was looking really hard because I could see the leaves moving, but I didn't see an animal. And then all of a sudden, I could make out a small bipedal figure, about 7 or 8 inches tall. It seemed to be trying to hide in amongst the leaves. As it tried to get across the road, it looked as if I could see a line of each part of the creature, but it seemed to be cloaked. Kind of what a chameleon does, but not quite the same. It moved with a ratchet movement, rather jerky. I don't know if that was its normal gait, or if it were injured. As I was driving at a crawl by this time, because what I was observing was so bizarre and I was trying to make out what it was, I was thinking what in the world this thing could be. It almost looked like a frail stick figure, as I could only make out some of it. I thought perhaps it was an emaciated squirrel, but they don't walk on 2 feet, and if it was that skinny, it would be dead, not jerking across the road. For these same reasons, it was not a featherless bird either. By now it had reached the centre line, and was attempting to cross the rest of the road when a pickup truck from the other side came speeding down it, and just missed it with its driver's side tyres. I saw the leaves behind it thrown about. I don't know if the stick thing made it or not, as cars behind me were honking at me to keep moving. I thought about turning around to see if I could find it, because that is what I would do for an animal. But this is not an animal that I have ever heard about or had seen before. The more that I thought about it, I realized that it may have been cloaked and was picking up the color of the leaves to disguise itself. It reminded me of the cloaked alien in the movie Predator. I could see it, but I couldn't make out exactly what it was. As I tried to rationalize this in my head, I thought maybe it was a reptile or a lizard of some kind, like a chameleon that can turn different colors in order to hide from predators. Octopus and cuttlefish can do the same thing, so perhaps we've just never seen them to know that they are even there. When I arrived at my friend's house that night, I told her about the story. She never doubted me, as I'm not prone to making things up. I'm a very rational person. But still, I wonder what that thing was, and if these predator-like entities exist all around us.
I never knew what to call them until recently. The other day I was curious to see if anyone else has experienced what I saw and felt, so I began to research translucent beings or predator-like sightings. That's when I learned that they are called Glimmermen, which eventually led me here. I had an experience with the Glimmerman in the late 90s at my parents' house in Lowell, Massachusetts. I will never forget this experience, as this was the most terrifying encounter I have ever had in my life. 2 deployments to Iraq and 8 years as a cop. Nothing comes close to the fear I had that day. I remember this happening in the late 90s, and I would say somewhere between 1997 to 1999. I would have been between 10 to 12 years old. We had 2 phone lines in our house. The main line, located by the living room, and the second in my brother's room. My 2 oldest brothers had already moved out of the house and my brother wasn't home at the time. I asked my mom if I could go hang out with my friend that lived 2 blocks away. She agreed, but I remember that she was using our main line. I went upstairs to use my brother's phone to call my friend. I walked into my brother's room and began to dial my buddy's number. I got about halfway through dialing and I froze. All the hairs on my body stood up and I was covered in goosebumps. It felt like my stomach sank. This feeling of being watched and that something came in the room behind me just hit me from nowhere. I knew it was there. I felt its presence. It was like it wanted me to know it was there. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and carefully turned around. It was standing in the doorway of my brother's room, blocking my escape. It was huge. It was as tall as the doorframe and about as wide. I couldn't see my eyes, but I knew it was staring at me. It looked crystal clear as water with the edge of a human form. Its cloaking or invisibility appeared to fluctuate. Like the way the light passed through it seemed to refract in different directions. Almost like water that could take human form, but it obviously wasn't water. The only other way I could describe it was like the predator. The short period of time that I locked eyes on this creature or being, I began to pray profusely and uncontrollably. It felt like I had no control and the words shot from my mouth. In seconds that probably felt like minutes, it stepped into the room and towards the windows across from the door. I never bothered to see where it went or if it disappeared. The moment I saw the opportunity to escape, I bolted from that room and down the stairs. I ran probably the fastest I have ever ran in my life. I'm not even sure how I didn't get hurt. My mom, who was just getting off of the phone, asked me if I was alright. She could tell something scared the hell out of me. I'm now 35 and thankfully, I haven't experienced or seen anything else like that since, and I'd like to keep it that way. I'm glad that I am not the only one who has seen them, as it made me question my sanity. I consider myself to be skeptical and still try to figure out logical explanations for what happened, and I can't.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.